Welcome to the National Academy of Sciences Science Session on Attracting and Retaining a Diverse Workforce. This is Susan Fiske. I organized it. I'm from Princeton University, where I have appointments in psychology and the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Affairs. We'll be joined by Brenda Major of the University of California, Santa Barbara, Claude Steele of Stanford, and Stacey Sinclair of Princeton. The issue that we're all tackling today is how to attract and retain a diverse workforce. It's a challenge, but it's a knowable challenge. The shared conclusion that we have is that the context can build trust and make that happen. But there's a science of diversity, and you're about to hear from some of the stars of that field. So now I'm going to introduce Brenda Major. She is well known for her work in stigma and diversity. And Brenda, take it.
Okay, so thank you for the opportunity to talk to the National Academy about our research. As we all know, and I am going to have to do a little switch here, because this is not working as well as we'd hope. Got a minor glitch. As we all know, we're working under new technological challenges in this COVID-19 world, so bear with us as we deal with Zoom. So promoting diversity, as we know, is a priority for many organizations around the world. It's also very big business. Available evidence indicates that there is reason for concern. Although the facts that it's a priority and a lot of money is being spent on diversity might make us optimistic, their comprehensive reviews of the literature conclude that most diversity initiatives actually don't result in more fair or diverse workplaces. In particular, there's no causal evidence that diversity programs, as currently implemented, are reducing prejudice, discrimination, or increasing the representation of women and minorities in positions of responsibility. And what I want to talk about in the remainder of my talk today, I want to make the case that diversity initiatives as currently implemented and promoted are sending mixed messages. Specifically, in addition to the messages that they intend to send, diversity initiatives are sending unintended signals about fairness, about inclusion, and about competence. And these unintended signals can be undermining the very goals of diversity. Let me start with the signal of fairness. One critical message of diversity is that this is an organization in which people will be treated fairly, that they will be treated without bias, without prejudice, and without discrimination. The perception of fair treatment is essential to a well-functioning organization and society. People who perceive that they're treated with respect, that they have a voice in what's going to happen with them, and that they are being treated without bias and discrimination are more content, they're more productive, they're more satisfied, they're more committed to their organization, and they're healthier. However, diversity initiatives send mixed signals about fairness. On the one hand, they communicate to underrepresented groups that they will be treated fairly. However, they often are sending a second signal in addition, and that is that overrepresented groups are going to be treated less fairly. And our work shows not only that both of these signals exist, but that both of these signals can have adverse consequences. Let's start with the fairness signal. The intended signal is that underrepresented groups will be treated fairly in this organization. And our research indicates that organizations with diversity initiatives are in fact perceived as more fair for minorities and women than organizations without those. It also shows, however, some unintended consequences of this perception. In our first study on this, in this area, We assigned white men to read a company profile, and embedded in the profile was a description of a mandatory training program for managers at that company. And the descriptions were almost identical, except in one condition, the training program focused on fostering women's success. And in the other condition, the training program just focused on fostering employee success. Participants then viewed a short list, a list of equally qualified men and women for a position. They saw the list of candidates who were available, saw that there were an equal number of qualified men and women, but also saw that in the short list, 7 out of the 10 people that were recommended for promotion were men. We then asked participants how fairly they thought women were being treated at that organization, and would they support sex discrimination litigation at that organization. As you can see, participants thought that women were being treated more fairly at the company with versus without diversity initiatives. Furthermore, they were also less likely to support litigation against sex discrimination at that company. And this occurred even though they indicated that they were aware that men were disproportionately being recommended for promotion, and the women were equally qualified. We've replicated this basic effect now across numerous experiments using a variety of types of diversity initiatives, including diversity training, diversity awards, diversity mission statements. Among white men and women, mentioning that a company had diversity initiatives versus not mentioning it decreased recognition of discrimination, despite evidence of poor treatment of women with regard to both hiring and wages, decreased support for litigation to address bias, increased derogation of minority discrimination claimants, and increased support for personnel procedures that are disadvantageous to women and minorities, such as unstructured as compared to structured interviews. Notably, these effects weren't moderated by any individual differences like prejudice among our participants. So a disturbing implication of this particular line of work is that the presence of diversity initiatives can actually undermine discrimination claimants' access to justice. An analysis of 1,000 federal civil rights legal decisions over a 35-year period, for example, concluded that judges deferred to diversity initiatives in deciding civil rights cases, using their mere presence as evidence of non-discrimination without establishing efficacy. And this is precisely the effect that our experiments are demonstrating. Our research also indicates that diversity initiatives can send a second unexpected and unintended fairness signal. And that is that members of traditionally overrepresented groups are going to be treated less fairly than members of minority groups. This can have a variety of adverse and unintended consequences, including causing majority groups to perceive and become more sensitive to discrimination. We conducted 3 experiments, for example, in which we compared whites' perceptions of discrimination at companies that advertised pro-diversity values versus at a company that did not, that mentioned in this particular case, hiring and looking for people who were unique. What the participants in these studies saw were 2 different videos, one for a company that emphasized diversity, one that did not. 93% of the material in the videos was the same. We didn't mention race or gender in the diversity video, only that the company was committed to diversity and inclusion. What we found in those studies was across all 3 experiments, whites perceived that there was a greater likelihood of discrimination against whites in the pro-diversity condition than in the control condition. And in addition, they perceived that in a company, and working for a company that emphasized diversity and inclusion, the likelihood of discrimination against whites was significantly higher than the likelihood of discrimination against minorities. In a subsequent series of experiments, we have asked whites to read about companies, again, that merely mention that they have a diversity initiative or don't mention it, and then to read about an employee at that company who indicated in a company survey that he'd been passed over for promotion in favor of another candidate named Tyrone, and he guessed that, and what he says is that he guessed that competition was fiercer than he expected. So what we found in those studies, is that the presence of a diversity initiative increased whites' perceptions that whites were less valued and less respected at the company, and increased the likelihood that whites saw anti-white bias at the company and attributed Tyrone's promotion to diversity. What was interesting is that we saw this effect even when whites were clearly advantaged in the company, even when the minority candidate who got the position was more qualified than the person who was passed over, and even when opportunities for success at the company were abundant as opposed to scarce. So one implication of this line of research is that the presence of diversity initiatives may actually encourage reverse discrimination lawsuits. The second signal that diversity's messages send is about inclusion. Specifically, a major goal of most diversity initiatives is to convey that ours is an inclusive organization where everyone belongs and is valued. This message is important. Humans possess a fundamental need to belong and are exquisitely sensitive to environmental cues that indicate whether they belong or are rejected in that context. Feelings of inclusion are associated with safety, positive emotions, greater productivity, and social engagement. Research indicates, however, that the presence of diversity initiatives sometimes, but not consistently, does signal inclusion to underrepresented groups. However, at the same time, research indicates that diversity initiatives often signal exclusion to members of traditionally overrepresented groups. In one of the first studies to show this phenomena, Victoria Plout and her colleagues used an implicit cognition test to show that whites are quicker to pair diversity-related words, such as difference and multiculturalism, with exclusion rather than inclusion, a difference that minorities did not show. In a follow-up study, Plout and her colleagues showed that whites were also less likely to associate words associated with diversity with the self-concept, and that the extent to which whites associated diversity with the self-concept predicted their endorsement of diversity policies. More recently, we conducted a study in which we invited white college men into our lab to participate in a simulated job interview, with the understanding that the person who gave the best interview would win $100. Prior to conducting the interview, they watched a videotape of the company that advertised, again, its pro-diversity values, or a control video that advertised basically that it was looking for unique people. We then measured their cardiovascular reactivity of these men during the interview. Basically, relative to what we were trying to determine is whether these men during the interview showed a threat cardiovascular profile or a challenge profile. And this can be determined basically from relative increases in vasoconstriction and decreases in cardiac output. A threat state is associated with more anxiety, more maladaptive health consequences, and often poorer performance. What we found in our study is that these white college men interviewing for a job that advertised pro-diversity values of inclusion were threatened. In contrast, they showed a challenge profile when interviewing for a job in the control condition. We also found that men interviewing for a job at the pro-diversity position performed slightly worse as coded by observers who were blind to condition. Despite these physiological and behavioral differences, however, they did not report that they'd be less comfortable at the diversity company or that they were less attracted to the diversity company, even though they did think in that study that the chances for discrimination against whites were again higher at the pro-diversity company than at the control company. One implication of this line of research is that the signals that are being sent by diversity initiatives may foster threat and backlash against diversity policies among traditionally advantaged groups who feel excluded by those policies, who feel that they do not apply to them. A third signal that diversity initiatives send has to do with competence. Diversity messages seek to convey that all people are capable and have something of value to contribute to the organization if given a level playing field and equivalent opportunity. But in fact, as typically implemented, diversity initiatives also send a second signal, one that underrepresented groups need help if they are to succeed. This message prompts attributions as to why members of underrepresented groups need help to succeed. And more than 30 years of research indicates that a common inference is that targeted groups need help to succeed because they're less competent. For example, women and underrepresented minorities promoted under an affirmative action program are viewed as less capable and less qualified than those not promoted under such programs. We and others have recently replicated these same effects with diversity initiatives instead of affirmative action programs. For example, Latino undergraduates at our university evaluated a highly competent Latino job applicant as less qualified if the hiring manager has simply indicated in his hiring recommendation that he would add diversity to the company. Research in our own lab, as well as others, has shown that this presumption of incompetence among underrepresented minorities and women due to the presence of diversity initiatives can also translate into self-doubt among members of these groups. In addition, because the presence of diversity initiatives provides an alternative reason other than merit for positive outcomes, diversity initiatives can create attributional ambiguity about why minorities are succeeding within the company. A recent study by Gundamir and colleagues also found that when whites read about a company that valued inclusion and valued differences, as opposed to one that valued merit, it activated more negative stereotypes about Blacks, and it led these participants to predict lower performance among Black employees. Activation of negative stereotypes, in turn, can result in stereotype threat, something that our next speaker is very familiar with. So, to conclude, there's substantial evidence that diversity initiatives send mixed messages about who is treated fairly, who is included, and who is competent. These unintended signals may undermine the effectiveness of diversity initiatives and prevent them from reaching their goals. This then leads to the question, what can we do about it? What are our policy implications? One is that we need to be attentive to these unintended signals that diversity initiatives send. Framing, I think, can help. Research suggests that combining an emphasis on diversity with an emphasis on merit and equal opportunity helps to mitigate some of the defensiveness and some of the concerns about competence and fairness among whites. Research also suggests that broadening the definition of diversity to include whites and men may decrease the feelings of exclusion that they often feel in the presence of such diversity initiatives, although that particular technique may not be received as positively by minorities. A second implication is that we need to empower rather than constrain. The research on diversity initiatives suggests actually that mandatory programs are less effective and are more likely to induce backlash than voluntary programs. And finally, perhaps the most important message to emerge from our research and other recent research on diversity is that we need to rigorously evaluate the effectiveness of the initiatives that we are spending so much money to implement. We shouldn't assume that the mere presence of a diversity initiative at a company will result in a good outcome. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak, and I'd like to thank my primary collaborators on the diversity project, who include Cheryl Kaiser at the University of Washington and Tessa Dover at Portland State. And I'd also like to thank the National Science Foundation for funding this research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brenda. That was fascinating and challenging, and we'll have, I think, some interesting discussions as a result of that. I think we'll save questions for the group question and answer period. So next up we have Claude Steele from Stanford, who is well known for his work on stereotype threat and for his book, his memoir, Whistling Vivaldi. So Claude.
Thank you, Susan. It's a real pleasure to be here. I apologize for I'm not sure whether I'm visible to people or not, given the challenges we've been facing, but I will go ahead anyway. The basic question that I want to talk about today is how to have a successfully diverse community. And by that, I'm referring to, in our institutions, in our classrooms, in our graduate programs, how do we make them work in the sense that people feel that they can contribute from the standpoint of their identities and yet won't be discriminated against or disadvantaged because of their identities. That sort of is, I think, one way of putting the fundamental challenge. It's writ a little larger than just the question of women in STEM fields, but much of what I have to say today, I think, generalizes to that question. And I want to end with an example of a successful effort in that regard. I think this challenge begins, a little bit of history is useful. I think it begins in the 60s when, as a result of probably a fruit of the civil rights movement, the Supreme Court decisions desegregating schools, various legislation, we decided to have an integrated society, a society in which the social contract of our institutions would extend to everybody in society, and not just a few or one group. And yet, our institutions, I'm thinking really, frankly, of higher institutions of higher education. I think the same point extends to other schooling and other kinds of organizations, but our institutions were born and evolved and developed in an era when we did not have that kind of commitment to be as inclusive as we decided to be as a society in the 60s. And so we are in a period, I think, 50 years down the road of trying to adapt our institutions to this challenge, this more democratic challenge, if you will. And that's the way I'd like to frame the talk today. How do we meet that challenge? Is there something central, simple, that boils down to things that people can do that will help these institutions achieve this larger goal? There are two parts to the talk in my mind. One is diagnosis. I'm going to put a lot of emphasis on the nature of trust in that diagnosis. And the second is remedy. What can we do? What specifically can we do to address this challenge I'm laying out? I think the story begins with the fact that we do have a profoundly diverse society. We're bringing people onto our campuses, into our institutions, who come from backgrounds and from groups that have had very different experiences, very different histories, very different ongoing experiences in this society. And we're trying to make those institutions work for a great breadth of people. That, I think, is the first fact to appreciate. We have had a tactic, a strategy for doing this that also came about in the 60s. It wasn't there before. And that is, I guess, in the everyday jargon, color blindness, or more accurately, probably, identity blindness. The idea was that, look, I will now, the institution says to the people it's trying to incorporate, I will now not see your group identity. And that's what I will offer. And your job is to work as hard as you can and assimilate to the mainstream of this institution and this society as fast as you can. And that's the way American society will incorporate the disenfranchised into the mainstream of society, that major project, if you will. That's the way we'll do it. And I know this approach has taken some hits in academia, some real criticisms, which I think are worthy, but I'm not sure we can really do without it in a diverse society. Identity blindness is a kind of standard of fairness when you think about all kinds of walks of life, like policing, access to good schools, access to investment capital, to good quality health care. We want those things to be identity blind and to be open fairly to everybody. So I think it is a profound commitment of our society, but I do think it causes a certain blindness, which may be at the core of what's made it difficult for us to move as fast as we might like to move in genuinely in creating a successfully diverse community in our institutions. And that blindness, I think, has to do with something I'm calling, for lack of a better term, I wish I had a better term, but I'm calling them identity contingencies. Things that go with your identity, conditions of life that you have to deal with because you have a particular identity. Think of women versus men. There are things that women have to contend with, expectations, patterns of rewards and punishments, all kinds of things, opportunities that women have to deal with that men don't have to deal with. Men have their own contingencies that they have to deal with. And when we're blind to, insistently blind to identity, we can miss the significance of these conditions of life. Think of African Americans. There are profound conditions of life that go with that identity still to this day. Just think that grow out of housing segregation alone, which is still quite a reality in our society. That affects the value of your house, your ability to accumulate wealth, your access to quality education, your access to, I needn't go on. There are realities tied to our identities. They are real, and some of them are material, as I've just alluded to, but some of them are psychological, and that's where the research of this set of scientists comes into play. I've done, and my colleagues, a lot of research on stereotype threat, which I think of as a contingency of identity. Let me explain what that is. Stereotype threat is a very simple thing. It's just being in a situation or doing something for which a negative stereotype about one of your identities, your age, your race, your gender, is relevant to what you're doing. When that happens and you care about what you're doing is important, you know that you could be judged or treated in terms of that stereotype, and that can be distracting and disorienting. And it's not only something that happens once and you sort of disprove the stereotype and you move on. It's a condition of life. You have to deal with that stereotype, contend with it in any situation that you go into, especially when people in new situations where you haven't had a chance to disprove it in the past. So I can give you a simple illustration. This is a study done years ago, not by me, but it's kind of cute, so I'll use it. This is athletes performing an athletic task. They're doing 10 holes of golf in a miniature lab room setup. And there are white athletes and black athletes. They're very committed, very serious. It's important to them how they do on this kind of task. And to put the white athletes under the stereotype threat that I'm describing, the task is simply introduced as a task as a standardized test of natural athletic ability. Do the best you can. That's the kind of instruction that sets up the situation. So as white athletes go through the golf task now, there could be in the back of their mind or in the front of their mind the worry that any frustration they may have is actually an indication or confirming the truth of this stereotype, that they lack natural athletic ability, and because they care about doing well as athletes, that's upsetting, distracting, and it could interfere with their performance on the golf task right there, and in fact it does. So under that representation of what that golf task is, the white athletes underperform compared to the black athletes. But interestingly, the tables can be turned by representing that task, that golfing task, in a different way. To put the black athletes under stereotype threat, the task was represented as a test of sports strategic intelligence. Now, as the black athletes go through that test, their frustrations, inevitable in that situation, their frustrations could signal that they're confirming that stereotype about their group. And because, again, they care about doing well on this task, that worry can distract them and upset them and interfere with their performance. And indeed, in that condition, they perform less well than the white athletes. So the tables are reversed there. And it gives you some indication of what how stereotype threat can affect performance and can affect persistence in a whole domain. If you think about women pursuing a career in a STEM field, the prospect of being something they care about and are invested in, the prospect of being seen in terms of the stereotype about women can be an ongoing pressure, a struggle that makes existence in that domain uncomfortable and can deter them from doing it. All identities, it's important to point out, and I think Brenda's research just did, all identities have negative stereotypes about them. And when you're in situations where they're relevant, you can feel it. White males certainly have negative stereotypes about them. And when they're in situations, say in a conversation about race or about gender, they can feel the pressure of saying something that might get them seen in terms of that stereotype, and it can make them uncomfortable in that situation, maybe make them avoid that. Well, I could go on in that vein, but I really want to point out that I think in general, something we haven't recognized about the reality of diverse situations and settings is that for all of us, there is a kind of tension involved. Will we be seen in terms of these stereotypes about our group? Will we do something that inadvertently confirms that, or will we not? Can we just forget about that and in an identity-free way engage the task at hand? That, I think, is a fundamental tension. And I would go so far as to say it's inherent in the diversity of our institutions that for these reasons, there is it challenges our trust, our ability to relax and to trust the situation. It's a situation in which I won't be seen that way, I won't be treated that way, that I can be comfortable in that situation. So I want to argue that that this issue of trust is a fundamental challenge that those of us interested in successful diversity and building successfully diverse communities have to meet. I also think focusing on building trust, this is where I hope the talk gets a little brighter and a little more hopeful. I think building trust is a way around some of the challenges that, for example, Brenda just outlined. I think it has some real inspirational capacity, if I can use that term in this kind of context. I'll give you another experiment just to show you how trust works. This was a study Jeff Cohen, Lee Ross, and I did some years ago. This has to do with race. How does a white professor give critical feedback to an African-American student? We had black and white students at Stanford write essays that they were told would be evaluated for possible publication in a new magazine on teaching. And they were to write about their favorite teachers, and then they were to come back 2 days later and they'd get feedback on the essays. And our question was, how much would they trust the feedback? How much would they be motivated by the feedback? And what we varied was how we gave the feedback. Is there a way for a white evaluator to give feedback in such a way that it would be trusted and effective for all students? What we found was that giving the feedback in a straightforward way or preceding the critical feedback with sort of ad hominem positive statement about the person did not work, not for the black students. For the black students, they didn't trust it. that feedback given that way and not trusting it, they weren't motivated to improve their essays. That, I think, is a profound finding in its own right, because it shows the significance of trust. That if you don't trust, you can't even benefit from critical, valuable feedback. And that's a situation that isn't, again, just once. It's something that persists and goes on in a person's experience in an institution like that. So it, I think, illustrates the significance of this. There was, though, good news in that study. One way of giving the feedback did work, and that was to say, as the feedback was given, look, we're using high standards in evaluating these essays, and I've read your essay, and I think you can meet those standards. Here's the feedback. I think it will be helpful. Well, when the feedback was given that way, acknowledging that high standards were being used and that the person had the potential to meet those standards, that signals to the Black students that they're not being seen in terms of that negative stereotype. And under that condition, they trusted it completely, and they were more motivated than any other subjects in the experiment to improve their essays. So I think it illustrates a kind of critical, points to a critical focus that our diversity efforts can take, building trust. Trust building is a game that is played on the ground, and it's a game that can be played by everybody. It involves showing up, listening, responding to, supporting people, and signaling that we invest in their potential, and that kind of thing can mobilize motivation and commitment. There is a field of intervention research looking at various angles of doing this, using cues that signal belongingness, that you really belong, that we see you as belonging in this situation, cues that signal that we are investing in and believe in your potential. This isn't saying you believe in realized ability. This is saying we admitted you because we believe in your potential. Reducing, cues that signal exclusion. All of the white male photographs, sacred as they are, on the math department walls probably are not a good sign for women trying to succeed in math in that same department. As I mentioned, playing the game on the ground, just being there, supporting people, being positive about their prospects. Okay, I want to, those are things that have been put to test, and as I say, there's a literature there. I want to end with what I hope is a hopeful example, and that is a study done by Rudy Mendoza and his colleagues at UC Berkeley, which was a survey of all of the science departments asking the question, do the women and minorities in those departments, do they make as fast and as much progress toward publication as the men in those departments do? Publication being, of course, in graduate school and graduate programs, the coin of the realm. So this is going right at the issue. Are these departments doing as well by their women and minority students as they are by men students in those departments? Physics, math, astronomy, earth and planetary sciences, computer sciences, electrical engineering. These were the departments looked at, physics, chemistry, and they found what they feared, which was that women and men and minorities were not doing as well as the men in progressing toward publication, except in the College of Chemistry. And in the College of Chemistry, the women and minorities were making as much progress toward publishing as the men were. There were no differences. Well, there's a bright spot. What is it that the College of Chemistry is doing that the other units are not doing? Well, it is a version of what I was just describing. It's pretty clear that at some point in their history, probably not motivated by an effort to diversify the program at all, but motivated by an effort to just plain produce the strongest graduates that they could possibly produce, and they do place a disproportionate number of women in academic positions throughout the country and the world. They decided to invest a lot in making their program really strong and supportive for students. So they bring them to campus 3 weeks earlier, earlier than school begins. They give them interviews with 5 faculty that present research to them. they're then they're encouraged to publish, and they're given sort of the cultural capital of graduate school right away, that this is about publishing. And courses are important, but they're instrumental to publishing, and you're becoming a scientist in this point, and that's the major goal, which sort of clears up what a lot of understanding of the situation. And then they have very clear monitored deadlines and the like, you know, by, let's say, November 11th, we'd like a proposal of research. Then by the March 3rd, we'd like the research done, and so on. They're scheduled to meet with faculty on a weekly basis, and the faculty and their meetings with graduate students are kept track of by the department, by the college. So they're essentially tightening the bolts of their graduate program in a way that signals to everybody that they are really being invested in by faculty. They see a responsiveness and a level of support and encouragement that maybe they're not seeing in the other institutions, in the other units. The other units, as I say, coming from an era when they weren't really expected to educate the full diversity of our population, are taking a more laissez-faire approach to graduate training. Let the talent, let the cream rise to the top. That's what we're doing here. It's not our job to do that. Well, in this program and in this era, against the challenge of a really diverse student population, we may have to come more to the students rather than expect them to come to us, because of the pressures that I just tried to describe. They're under a different set of pressures, different set of contingencies because of their identities, and they need signals that this institution values them and expects them to succeed. It's relatively simple to give them. And it produced, I think, a very dramatic outcome here, and an outcome that is at scale, that is a whole entire graduate program. One of the niceties I think that's important to point out is that all faculty can be involved in this. So much of the time, people think, well, only minority faculty can work with minority students, and only women can work with women students. And as I say, trust is something that it's a ground game. And people are more interested probably in who they can trust as somebody who's really invested in them and willing to support them than in their identities per se. And that is something that's available to all faculty in developing students. So I just wanted to underline that in closing, and I'm probably out or maybe over my time, so I'll stop at this point. Thank you.
That was great, Claude. Thank you very much. I like to think of it as wise inclusion, borrowing one of your terms. Let's turn now to my colleague, Stacey Sinclair, who is going to continue this discussion and share her screen.
So hello, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking Susan Fiske for inviting me to be on this panel. It is a great chance to be able to spend some time with three of my favorite social psychologists, and a great time to share my research with all of you mysterious people on the internet. Thank you for spending some of your Sunday with us. I'd also like to begin by thanking my collaborators in this work, Jordan Stark, Nicole Shelton, who are both at Princeton University, and Natasha Warwiku, who is at Tufts University. So I'm part of a team. I'm simply the member of the team who was lucky enough to get to share our work with you. Much of the extant research in psychology about best practices for recruiting and retaining diverse workforces focuses on the question of whether or not we should pay attention to group membership. In this debate, there is a distinction between colorblindness, the idea that we should simply ignore racial and other demographic categories, and multiculturalism, the idea that we should acknowledge and celebrate differences. Now, there are pros and cons of both approaches, But you're given automatic processing of the strong visual cues associated with demographic characteristics like race or gender, it's difficult to actually enact a color blindness. As such, it's necessary to tackle ways to move forward while recognizing differences. To this end, our lab is conducting a relatively new line of research for us that doesn't ask, should we pay attention to group membership, but why we pay attention to group membership and the impact of these reasons. In particular, we identify two kinds of reasons. Moral reasons. These are motivated by values, most often fairness and justice. And instrumental reasons. In this case, diversity is thought to achieve some kind of practical end for the organization. Most often in the context of business and higher education, this usefulness is characterized as diversity enhancing learning and or diversity enhancing creativity. For us, we refer to these different categories of reasons as diversity frames. You can see these diversity frames in judicial decisions relating to affirmative action. So in Carter and Gallagher, which is about hiring in the fire department, it was decided that affirmative action was allowable because it eliminated the effects of past racial discriminatory practices. In contrast, in 2003, Sandra Day O'Connor contended that affirmative action was only allowable because numerous studies showed that student body diversity promoted learning outcomes. It better prepared students for an increasingly diverse workforce and society. Timer. And the evolution of moral to instrumental frames in these examples is representative of the evolution of relevant judicial decision-making. In fact, sociologists have argued that the instrumental frame is the only legally defensible frame available at this moment. If you are interested in court decisions in particular, Victoria Plout, who's at University of Berkeley, has done an excellent analysis of moral versus instrumental frames in affirmative action related judicial decisions. Okay. You can see these frames also in university messaging. These are taken from two prominent university websites. On one hand, a university argues that diversity renews the campus's commitment to provide fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all. In contrast, another university argues that diversity is a cornerstone of their university culture because when people from different backgrounds come together, they can exchange ideas and question assumptions. Anita Rattan, who's at the University of London Business School, has done a similar analysis of Fortune 500 websites and found this distinction as well. Finally, in Natasha Wariku's book, The Diversity Bargain, she shows that in interviews with college students, these frames seem to be absorbed into their everyday approach to schooling. So on one hand, a student is quoted as saying, diversity efforts are important because in this country, everything is not fair, everything hasn't been fair, and so you need to adjust for those things that haven't been done fairly. In contrast, another student is quoted as saying diversity efforts are for the good of the college experience because college, to remain anonymous, doesn't need to send some white guy to Wall Street who's never interacted with a Black person. He's going to be a business analyst and under someone who, is a Black guy from some other school. So he needs to know how to interact with or have been around people of different cultures. So here you can see the intergroup interaction is very much a tool for education. So how do these different diversity frames affect the expectations and experiences of ethnic majority and minority group people? Today, I'm going to show you some illustrative studies from our lab that show instrumental frames are more prevalent than moral ones. They change the definition of diversity. Whites, but not ethnic minorities, prefer instrumental frames to moral frames, and instrumental frames may be worse for ethnic minority student outcomes. Please note that all of our work thus far is in the context of higher education, and I will try and note the instances where there's analogous work in business contexts. So first, prevalence. One way we looked at prevalence was by having a pair of research assistants in a standardized way scrape all of the diversity text from university websites. We looked at the top 200 national universities according to US News and World Report and on 2017. We then had a separate pair of research assistants code all this text for the degree to which the text illustrated themes related to instrumentality or to morality on a 0 to 3 scale. According to our coders, the websites reflected more instrumental themes than moral themes. Of course, given judicial guidance, it might be the case that universities are publicly presenting a more instrumental image rather than this reflecting the true institutional norms. To determine whether this was the case, we were able to get a sample of admission officers. We described the instrumental frame, the moral frame, and we asked them how prevalent each perspective was among the admissions community. The admissions officers' responses confirmed our analysis of the websites. They thought instrumental frames were more normative than moral frames. So instrumental frames are more prevalent. Why might we care about this? One reason we might care is because instrumental frames change the definition of diversity to include whites to a greater degree and to include ethnic minorities to a lesser degree. In 5 online experiments thus far, we've shown this by describing universities as having an instrumental frame or a moral frame. You can see the examples on the screen. Much of the text is whited out just to prevent you from trying to read it. It's long, and the text just reiterates what's in the quotes. Sometimes we also have a control condition in which diversity is cast as curricular diversity, as opposed to diversity brought about by exposure to different kinds of people. After each university description, we asked participants a few questions, including how likely is it that different groups are included in the university's definition of diversity. We asked about a range of groups like musicians and conservatives, but for the purpose of today, we're going to focus on the inclusion of Latinx, Black, and whites in the definition of diversity. As you can see here, if you compare the white and Black bars, instrumentally framed universities are thought to include Latinx and Black individuals in the definition of diversity less than universities that have a morally framed diversity mission. But we find the exact opposite for whites. They are thought to be included more in the definition of diversity under an instrumental frame than a moral frame. And Sophie Trewalter at University of Virginia and some labs, other labs in business schools have shown similar expansion of the definition of diversity as well in the business context. Okay. In addition, diversity or instrumental diversity frames are preferred by whites, but not ethnic minorities. In about 4 online experiments, we again exposed participants to university statements depicting an instrumental frame or a moral frame, and sometimes a control condition. This time, we asked participants a series of questions, including how positively they felt toward the university and how likely they would be to go there. You can see here, again, comparing the solid white and Black bars, that the instrumental frame was met with more positivity on the part of our white participants compared to a moral frame. Now, this looks like a tiny effect, and it is. But in a couple of studies, we also asked participants which of the universities they would choose, which is more analogous to how we make decisions when we are choosing an actual college, where we can only go to one at a time. And here is a result from one of those studies. In this instance, about 75% of our white participants chose the instrumentally framed university, and only 25% of our participants chose the morally framed one. Now, we had some intuitions based on the literature about the basis of these preferences. And you should see some of these themes. They should seem familiar to you from Brenda and Claude's talks. First, we thought that whites would perceive instrumentally framed universities as bringing more value because, right, diversity is construed as another educational affordance. We thought they would also anticipate greater belonging at instrumentally framed universities because the definition of diversity is expanded to include whites to a greater degree. And lastly, we thought whites would anticipate less social identity threat in instrumentally framed universities because the instrumental frame decreases a focus on justice, injustice, and fairness. We found support for all three of these mediators in our research, but I am not going to bother walk you through these results just in the interest of time. You'll have to trust me, but you can always ask me questions in the question and answer. So I talked about whites, but how do ethnic minorities feel about these frames? My favorite demonstration of this is a data collection we did with parents. So parents of students who were actually either actively selecting or had just selected the college they wanted to attend. Okay. This data collection had to be done very quickly. It was in person. And so we had to collapse our questionnaire to make it proceed more efficiently. Again, I'm not going to walk you through the details of how we did that. But the important thing to know is that it's going to change how the data are presented. So what you're going to see is a response regarding, in this instance, positivity, but instead you'll see one bar where higher numbers mean more instrumental, lower numbers mean more moral, and 4 is the neutral point. So according to our parents, you can see with respect to the white bar, our white parents preferred the instrumentally framed university for their student compared to the morally framed university. But this preference was unique to white parents. Black, Latinx, and Asian parents did not have this preference. In fact, for Black and Latinx parents, they preferred the morally framed university. We replicate this basic pattern with a nationally representative sample of white and Black individuals as well. So instrumental frames may be more prevalent. They expand the definition of diversity. Whites, but not ethnic minorities, prefer them. Lastly, I'd want to contend that these frames actually might be worse for ethnic minority outcomes than moral frames. One way we can get at this is by revisiting our admission officers' data. So in this data collection, we, in addition to asking about the prevalence of instrumental and moral frames, we also asked admissions officers what they thought Black and white students would prefer, what they thought or why they thought these preferences would occur, and how they thought white and Black students would fare in an instrumentally versus a morally framed university. Again, right, we're going to see hot bars such that higher numbers are more instrumental, low is more moral, and 4 is the neutral point. Focusing on the white bars, you can see that admissions officers thought white students would prefer the instrumentally framed university. They thought white students would expect more value, more belonging and less social identity threat in those contexts. In comparison, they thought Black students would prefer the morally motivated university. They thought Black students would get more value or expect more value, belonging, and less identity and less social identity threat in that context. Importantly, when considering outcomes, the admissions officers also thought white students would fare better academically and emotionally in an instrumentally framed university. In contrast, the admissions officers thought thought specifically African-American students would fare better emotionally in a morally framed university. I find this result really interesting because these are admissions officers. They are tasked with encouraging students of all sorts to come to the universities, and they seem to have trepidations about this instrumental framing with respect to minorities. To take a first look at whether the admissions officers' intuitions may be correct, we decided to look at graduation rates. Now, graduation rates are a fundamental outcome of college, and we can't hope to fully include members of diverse groups in our workplaces if we are unable to get them to graduate from college. As a first step for looking at this, we went back to our websites that were coded for instrumental versus moral themes. We combined this data with US Department statistics regarding the portion of white and Black full-time students that graduated at these universities. And we integrated a number of controls that both predicted graduation rates and predicted the framing of the university. So with these controls in mind, we were interested in how the university frame related to the graduation rate. And what we found was no relationship for the graduation rates of whites, but an interesting relationship for the graduation of Blacks. So I want to draw your attention to the solid black line. That line represents universities that were rated as being low in morality. Now, if we focus on those universities that are low in moral themes, the greater the instrumentality at those universities, the lower the graduation rate of African-American students. When we do analyses looking at Latinx students, we find the exact same pattern. This pattern does not hold for Asian American students. So hopefully I've convinced you to some extent that instrumental frames are more prevalent. They change the definition of diversity. Whites, but not ethnic minorities, prefer them, and they may be related to less efficacious student outcomes for ethnic minorities. So what does this mean? First of all, I would be forthright in saying this is an ongoing line of research. And so the specific mechanisms by which these frames may differentially impact academic or other kinds of organizational success are to be determined. But I can confidently say that we need to be cognizant about how and why we welcome people from diverse backgrounds into organizations. Ironically, right, in the research that I've just discussed with you, the more prevalent diversity frame is more about whites, and it's also preferred by whites. And one can imagine organizational situations in which this is the case. It's going to be tough for them to develop the sense of trust that Professor Steele discussed among ethnic minorities. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stacey. Our speakers have presented us with some interesting challenges. And what I'd like to do is discuss just a little bit what people have said and then turn to some of the questions that have come in while they've been talking. Okay, so what I'd like to do is, as discussant, a friend of mine once said, there are three ways to be a discussant. One is to be a talking journal review article and say all the talks were less good than you thought, or to be a talking letter of reference and say they're all better than you thought, or you can just talk about your own work. So I'm going to bring up some work that we've done that I think is a missing component, and then try to talk about unifying what we've said. So I think many of the listeners to these talks are, genuinely interested in attracting and retaining a diverse workforce, but it's a challenge. And you folks have brought up all the different ways that attempts to diversify your work group can go wrong and can go badly wrong. And what I want to encourage people to realize is there may be tensions and disruptions in first trying to do this, but that over time you can be optimistic. So I'm going to take 5 minutes to try to make that case empirically. What I want to argue is that people adapt to diversity over time. And there's been some work published recently in PNAS by Miguel Ramos and others showing that in more than 100 different countries, when religious diversity increases, people's well-being goes down, but that in 4 to 8 years, depending on the country, it rebounds completely and recovers. And I think there's also work in organizational psychology showing that when you diversify a work group, at first there's tension and attrition and problems, and but then if they survive that, then the work group is better. So what we've been hearing are some things that could make things go wrong in the short run. So if you have the wrong kind of intention if you have an instrumental intention, as Stacey Sinclair has just been saying, you may make underrepresented groups uncomfortable. Building trust, as Claude Steele has suggested, takes time, and signaling the wrong kind of intent, as Brenda Major argued, can make things go badly wrong. But what I want to suggest in a more sort of optimistic way is that if you give people time, they appreciate their similarities. And this is some work that's coming out in PNAS with Bai and Ramos. So normally when people think about other groups, they have a sort of mental map of the groups as all being quite different from each other, and they accordingly stereotype them and treat them differently. But what I want to say is that the three of us have found that at 3 different levels, people differentiate each other less the more diverse they are. So this is a depiction of the level of differentiation. So the example on the right, Lebanon, is people differentiate more among groups than in South Africa, which is more diverse. So with diversity, there's a melting pot in countries that have been chronically more diverse than others. So in effect, people are stereotyping each other less the more they get used to each other in a diverse setting. The same thing happens in diverse states in the United States. If you do a state level analysis in some place like Wisconsin, which is not very diverse, or in Vermont, they have very clear ideas about different kinds of groups they've never met. But in places that are more diverse, like Hawaii is an extreme example, but even without Hawaii, New York is very diverse, and people say, well, we're all New Yorkers. They don't differentiate as much. This happens at the individual level. People who, in the states data that I just mentioned, who perceive more diversity, differentiate less among different kinds of groups. And you can even see it in students who go from a high school. This would be the triangular students who are starting the same type of diversity of high school. When they go to a more diverse more diverse college, they distinguish among outgroups less. So my point is that if you give people time to adapt under the right circumstances, then they may assimilate each other more. So I'm putting up these sort of takeaway messages just to orient us to everybody's talks. And I'd like to make sure everybody, all the speakers are unmuted so that we can all talk to each other and answer questions. So I'd like to start with Brenda Major. There was a question that came in over the chat.
You are muted.
Oh. Claude, I think your phone might be echoing. Let me try Brenda. Maybe just you unmute yourself. So
I can hear.
one question is whether it matters who the messenger is. That is, who presents the signals.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. That's not something that we have actually ever looked at in our work, because in each case that I am aware of, the message about, this company imposes, has a such and such a diversity initiative training program awards is embedded within the company materials. So the message comes from the company and then ostensibly from the leaders of that company. And there is work to suggest, certainly in the diversity and the whole contact area, to suggest that messages coming from the people at the top about contact and diversity are going to be more effective than those coming from the bottom. So I would say it can make a difference, but it's not something that we've looked at in our work.
Yeah, the person was concerned that it not just come from the diversity officer.
Right, right. That's certainly not been the case in the work we've done. It's part of the company's own description, mission statement, etc.
Right. And Claude, you've challenged people to build trust in these various ways. You make it sound easy: show up, listen, be supportive. Do you have any advice for people who are personally not members of the groups that are left out of their workplace about how they can learn how to do this without being embarrassed or being awkward or being inauthentic?
I think
you have to turn off your computer.
Yeah.
There you go.
Good. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I think it helps to have work to do together. That's why I think faculty often have an advantage, because there is the task at hand, and I think behavior in that gives people an opportunity to build the kind of genuine trust that I'm trying to describe. I think that's what the chemistry department did at Berkeley did at a program level, is to really make that the focus, the work, becoming a good chemist, becoming a good mathematician, becoming a good psychologist, and just being really responsive, confidence engendering, and supportive in that. So I know maybe it can sound glib, but I don't think it's hard. I think it takes just a different recognizing the need for that kind of orientation in a schooling context. We tend to view schooling context as so ability driven by a person's ability. That performance is a reflection of that, and that ability will prevail over time, and it takes care of itself. But what we're not recognizing in that is all of the barriers that can suppress the expression of ability that will come out when work is genuinely engaged. I mean, I think my own personal experience, I think probably everybody can, the climate, the atmosphere of instruction in our lives at certain points really enabled us to engage things that we were surprised we could do, or surprised we could enjoy. And so I do think, I know it's, again, glib, but I do think it isn't as hard as we think. It isn't as mysterious as we think. It's a matter of giving these supportive, confidence-building signals at base, and consistently, developing that into the fabric of our relationships.
I think I would really agree with you about the effectiveness of this, and I think that the more people realize how interdependent they are, we know this from the contact hypothesis, but just in everyday teams, when people need each other, they pay attention, and they get less concerned with the categories that they belong to and more concerned with a shared project. And I think that that kind of relationship is important. And Stacey Sinclair, much of your research is about relationship building and how that can have good effects on people learning to get along with each other. Do you want to say something about that? Because you didn't really address that in your presentation.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I would agree. So much of my work is on this concept of shared reality. So seeing the world the same way in a given moment. And so to the extent that these team interactions can afford a sense of shared reality so that you see the world the same way as the other person, then that should make you more confident in the work that you do, but it also should afford a sense of connection among individuals within the team.
And I'm also going to ask you to speak to the National Academies as an example of a place that has a diversity statement. So Stacey and I co-conspired about this beforehand. I'm going to put it up on the screen.
Yeah, it was interesting. So we had wondered whether there was a diversity statement. This is what we found online. And I thought it was interesting. Susan and I collaborated on coding it. And so the red is thought to represent instrumental themes, and the blue is thought to possibly represent moral themes. And what's interesting is the instrumental themes are very clear. The moral themes, I think, are more implied. And what this means for the functioning of the organization, and obviously as an outsider, is unclear to me, but it struck me as interesting because what it doesn't do is take the moral frame perspective of thinking about the affordances of being a member of the academy, and the processes by which an individual becomes a member of the academy. So thinking about these questions explicitly of justice and fairness. So I would love to sort of talk to people who constructed this and to get a sense of what their thinking was.
Well, I will say that on the ground, as Claude would say, there's a lot of interest in diversifying not only the members, but the staff and the volunteers and all different.
Right. And then I think the key, right, in that instance, to the extent that the motivation is instrumental, is thinking through these issues that Brenda and Claude have spoken to so well, about also being supportive and thinking about fairness and thinking about inclusivity.
So I'd like to turn it back to the presenters and ask you whether there are questions you wish that somebody had asked you.
I have a question for Brenda.
Okay.
Can we do that?
Sure.
So, I mean, it was interesting listening to your talk just before my talk, right? So in your work, you're talking about diversity initiatives in this broad way. And in our work, we parse sort of what the intentions are behind those diversity initiatives.
Right.
How do you think these things intersect? Do you think your version of diversity is a moral version or something else?
That's a really interesting question, and I was thinking of it as I was listening to your talk. We have not manipulated that. We have a mandatory training program. Our vision of I think that because we mention inclusion, we value a diverse workforce, inclusion, we're not emphasizing in any of these statements the instrumental piece, but nor do we have we said to, you know, encourage justice and whatever. So we've sort of gone right down the middle. So it's interesting whether, as I was listening to you, if one manipulated that, would you see, and it sounds to me like if we made it more justice, used more of the justice frame, we would enhance feelings of exclusion among white participants. If we made it more of the instrumental frame, we might diminish that, but flip that and enhance exclusion, you know, or not as strong as inclusion among the minorities. So I was absolutely thinking that that frame could push each of these things. I think it'd be interesting, but it wasn't clear to me how it would impact the attribution that minorities need more help and the competence stuff that flows from that. And so I was thinking about yours, that it would be interesting to look at the moral, at the instrumental and justice frames with regard to those perceptions.
Got it. Which is funny because during your talk, I was really struggling with that. If I had to come up with a prediction, I wonder, because I get the sense, my intuition is that both frames may be problematic from this competence perspective, because they're, or not, well, they might be from this competence perspective because the arguments around justice imply that there was some kind of educational system, right, that prevented ethnic minorities from getting as much as they could have.
Right.
And I think in the instrumental frame, at least in the context of higher education, I think there's this tacit understanding that what the ethnic minority students are bringing is some kind of life experience, right?
Yes,
that
right.
is not being a great chemistry student, it's something else.
Yeah, interesting. So it'd be very, it made me wonder this about exactly that. Be interesting question to test.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a question from somebody who is finishing up as a PhD, who is an underrepresented person in their discipline. And this person is concerned about being underrepresented also in their first job and the first location that they go to. What kind of recommendations would you guys have for somebody who is on the receiving end of a lot of this kind of thing? In what cues to look for in a university setting or in a town that they might be moving to, small college town? We've been giving advice to the people in charge. What about the people who are on the receiving end of a lot of this?
Because I didn't like the way I answered that last question. I guess I'll start with an example. I read an interview of an anthropologist who interviewed the parents of Emmett Till, who was was famously murdered in the 60s. It was a racist murder, and it was extremely upsetting, and it really mobilized the African American community. It was a symbol of the civil rights era, and they were interviewing years later the parents, and they said, well, how do you choose who do you associate with? And they said, well, they said something interesting. We look for who we can trust. And race is a factor, but it's not all determining. And I think we do miss that in our thinking about these things. That one thing I want in a situation where I'm under the kind of pressures that we're all talking about is a viable path forward, something that I can do that will work and that will kind of tell me where I'm at in this situation and give me the next thing to do. It's basically, I think, sort of Lazarus stress theory. There's the primary appraisal. Yes, it is threatening. There's the secondary appraisal. I know what to do about it. And it reduces the pressure that I'm under to have a clear kind of a response. And so coming into a situation like that, I think that's a useful thing to manage oneself, is to understand. Yes, there's stresses. You're not going to know. You're not going to have answers to everything, but But what you're looking for is a way forward that's going to be supported, and for people that will help you do that, that will really help you get to where you want. There's a lot of talk and a lot of things going on, but at the same time, you've got an opportunity here, and you've got your own interests and needs, and you kind of want to have that as part of your focus. Maybe not all of it, but part of your focus is grounding yourself in a concrete path forward that enables you to kind of mitigate that threat and looks for people that will help you with that. And so you can find surprising people who you wouldn't think on the face of it. You know, I have heard, well, I won't say this, but sometimes people who might express, you know, questionable views really help you down on the ground. I'll just leave it at that. That the expression of sort of correct political, that isn't necessarily the person who's going to be the most helpful and supportive and sustaining in a relationship. And I think for a person facing that kind of a situation, you kind of learn to make that discrimination. Who can I really count on here? And I think that's the way I would orient to that challenge.
Well, I think that's a great way to finish up, not to make category-based decisions, but to see who really comes through on the ground. And also for people who are trying to design the diversity interventions, I think we've heard some great advice. And I want to thank everybody for coming. And so thank you, everybody, and particularly to the speakers.